A rude journalist stood up and tried to humiliate Princess Diana in front of hundreds, but what she said next left every camera frozen, every reporter silent, and every soul in that room forever changed. It was the autumn of 1995, and London was draped in that particular kind of grey that seems to seep into your bones. The leaves had begun their slow descent from the trees, carpeting the ancient streets in shades of amber and rust. Inside the grand hall of the Royal Geographical Society in Kensington, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow across the ornate ceiling, their light dancing across faces that had gathered for what was billed as a charity event press conference. Diana had arrived wearing a navy suit with subtle elegance, her blonde hair swept back in a way that revealed the vulnerability in her eyes that had seen too much, carried too much, yet still sparkled with an unwavering commitment to the causes she held dear. This was a woman who had learned to wear armor made not of steel, but of compassion, who had discovered that the greatest shield against cruelty was not to become cruel herself, but to remain impossibly, beautifully kind. The event was meant to shine a light on landmine victims, a cause that had become Diana's crusade, her way of channeling personal pain into global healing. Photographers lined the walls, their cameras clicking like mechanical heartbeats. Reporters sat with notebooks open, pens poised. The air smelled of expensive perfume and polished wood, of power and scrutiny. Diana sat at the center of the long table, flanked by charity organizers, her hands folded gently in her lap. She smiled that famous smile, the one that could light up a room or hide an ocean of sorrow, depending on what the moment required. She had learned to navigate these spaces, these rooms full of people who saw her as everything from saint to scandal, from fairy tale princess to cautionary tale. She had learned that every word she spoke would be dissected, every gesture analyzed, every silence interpreted. And still, she showed up. Among the sea of journalists, there sat a man whose presence carried a different energy. His name was Marcus Whitfield, a tabloid reporter known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to ask questions that drew blood rather than insight. He had built his career on controversy, on pushing boundaries, on finding the cracks in people's armor and prying them wider. He sat 3 rows back, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on Diana with an intensity that bordered on predatory. He had come prepared. He had come with a question designed not to inform, but to wound. In his mind, this was his moment, his chance to rattle the princess, to catch her off guard, to create a headline that would sell papers and cement his reputation as the journalist who could make royalty squirm. He didn't see a woman trying to use her platform for good. He saw a target. He saw vulnerability as weakness and compassion as naivety. He was wrong on both counts. The press conference proceeded smoothly at first. Diana spoke about her recent visit to Angola, her voice soft but steady as she described meeting children whose lives had been shattered by landmines. She talked about a little boy named Joao, who had lost both legs and still managed to smile when she held his hand. Her eyes misted as she spoke, and the room leaned in, captivated not just by her words but by the raw humanity in them. She wasn't reading from a script. She was sharing pieces of her heart. Question after question came from the journalists, most respectful, some probing, all answered with that careful balance of honesty and diplomacy that Diana had perfected over years of living under the world's most unforgiving microscope. Then Marcus Whitfield raised his hand. The moderator called on him, and he stood slowly, deliberately, letting the moment stretch. Diana's gaze met his, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered in her expression, a recognition, perhaps, of danger. But she didn't look away. She never did. Whitfield cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the room with calculated sharpness. "Princess Diana," he began, his tone dripping with false courtesy, "you speak passionately about victims of landmines, about children suffering, about global compassion. But many would argue that you yourself have been the cause of considerable suffering to your former husband, to the royal family, to the institution of the monarchy itself. How can you claim moral authority to speak about compassion and healing when your own personal life has been marked by scandal, betrayal, and what some might call selfish behavior? Aren't you being hypocritical by positioning yourself as a humanitarian when you've caused so much pain to those closest to you? The room went deathly silent. It was as if someone had drawn all the oxygen from the space. Cameras stopped clicking. Pens stopped moving. Every eye turned to Diana, waiting to see if she would crack, if the armor would finally break, if the fairy tale would end in tears or rage. The charity organizers beside her shifted uncomfortably. One reached toward her arm as if to intervene, but Diana gently shook her head. She didn't need rescuing. The question hung in the air like poison, designed to reduce her humanitarian work to nothing more than a desperate attempt at redemption, to paint her compassion as performance, to strip away the legitimacy of everything she was trying to build from the ruins of her broken marriage and shattered dreams. Diana didn't respond immediately. She sat there, her hands still folded in her lap, her posture straight but not rigid. Her expression didn't harden into anger or collapse into hurt. Instead, something remarkable happened. Her eyes, those blue eyes that had been photographed 1,000,000 times, grew soft with understanding. Not pity, not condescension, but genuine recognition of the humanity even in her accuser. She took a slow, deliberate breath, and in that breath was years of therapy, of self-reflection, of learning to separate who she was from what people said about her. She had been called everything: saint and sinner, victim and villain, manipulator and martyr. She had learned that other people's perceptions were mirrors of their own struggles, not reflections of her truth. And so she didn't react from that wounded place inside her that Whitfield had tried to strike. She responded from somewhere deeper, somewhere wiser, somewhere impossibly brave. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but it carried a weight that made every person in that room lean forward to catch each word. "That's a very honest question," she said, and there was no sarcasm in her tone, no defensive edge. "And I appreciate your honesty, even when it's difficult to hear." She paused, letting that acknowledgement settle. "You're right that my personal life has been complicated, painful, and very public. I've made mistakes. I've hurt people I love. I've been hurt in return. None of that is a secret, and I don't pretend otherwise." Her voice remained steady, each word chosen with care. "But I would ask you to consider this. Does the fact that I have struggled, that I have experienced pain, that I have been broken and am still learning to heal, does that disqualify me from caring about others who are suffering? Or does it perhaps make me more qualified?" The shift in the room was palpable. People who had been holding their breath began to breathe again, but differently now, softer, more reverent. Diana continued, her gaze never leaving Whitfield's face, speaking directly to him as if they were the only two people in the room. "I don't claim to be perfect. I don't claim to have all the answers. What I do claim is that I know what it feels like to be reduced to a headline, to have your worst moments defined as your only moments, to be judged without mercy. And because I know that pain, I refuse to look away when I see it in others. When I hold the hand of a child who has lost their legs to a landmine, I'm not doing it because I'm some kind of saint. I'm doing it because I know what it feels like to have your life exploded by circumstances beyond your control. I know what it feels like to have to learn to walk again, metaphorically speaking, to find new purpose when everything you thought you were has been taken away." Her voice grew even softer, but somehow more powerful. "You ask if I'm being hypocritical. I would ask you if we should only allow perfect people to care about suffering. If we should only permit those without scars to tend to the wounded. Because if that's the standard, then I think we'll find ourselves in a very lonely world with very few healers." She paused again, and in that pause was everything: forgiveness, understanding, an invitation to see her not as a target but as a fellow human being navigating an impossibly complex existence. I'm not here to defend my past or to ask for your approval of my choices. I'm here because children are dying, because families are being destroyed, and because I have a platform that can help. If my imperfect life can serve a perfect purpose, then I'm willing to endure questions like yours. I'm willing to be doubted, to be criticized, to be called a hypocrite, if it means that even one more child might be spared the suffering I've witnessed. The transformation in that room was extraordinary. What had begun as an ambush, a calculated attempt to humiliate and diminish, had become something else entirely, a masterclass in grace under fire, a demonstration of how strength can wear the face of vulnerability, how wisdom can emerge from wounds. The journalists, hardened by years of chasing stories and exposing scandals, found themselves blinking back unexpected emotion. Several wiped at their eyes. Others sat stunned, pens forgotten in their hands. Even the photographers, who had been ready to capture Diana's breakdown, found themselves lowering their cameras, as if to intrude on this moment would be a violation of something sacred. Marcus Whitfield stood frozen, his question, so sharp and cutting when it left his mouth, now hanging in the air like a boomerang that had returned to strike him instead. His face, which had been set in that hard mask of journalistic aggression, began to soften. His jaw loosened. His eyes, which had been narrowed with predatory focus, widened with something that looked remarkably like shame. He had come to expose a hypocrite and had instead encountered something he hadn't expected: authentic humanity. He had tried to trap Diana in her past, and she had responded by inviting him into a future where pain could be transformed into purpose, where mistakes didn't disqualify you from meaning, where brokenness could become the very thing that equipped you to help others heal. He tried to speak, to perhaps apologize or clarify, but no words came. He simply sat down, his question answered not with defensiveness or denial, but with a truth so profound it left him speechless. Diana let the silence hang for just a moment longer, then she smiled, not triumphantly, but with genuine warmth. "Thank you for your question," she said, and there was no trace of irony in her gratitude. "These are the conversations we need to have, about who gets to be human, about who gets to make mistakes and still be allowed to contribute something meaningful to the world, about whether suffering disqualifies us or equips us." She turned her attention back to the rest of the room, seamlessly redirecting the focus to the cause that had brought them all there. She spoke more about the landmine crisis, about the charity work being done, about how people could help. But the energy in the room had changed completely. What had been a standard press conference had become a moment of collective revelation. After the event ended, something remarkable happened. Journalists who had come hungry for scandal found themselves writing different stories. Not about Diana's past mistakes or her troubled marriage, but about her courage, her compassion, her ability to transform pain into purpose. The headlines that emerged from that day weren't what Marcus Whitfield had hoped to create. Instead, they read, "Princess Diana responds to criticism with grace and wisdom. The People's Princess reminds us why imperfection doesn't disqualify compassion. Diana's powerful response to hostile journalists silences critics." Even Whitfield himself, in a column published weeks later, would write about that moment, admitting that he had come to the press conference with prejudice and had left with perspective. He wrote that Diana had taught him something that day, that asking hard questions is a journalist's job, but so is recognizing when you've received an answer that transcends the question, when you've witnessed something that matters more than the story you came to write. The moral lesson embedded in this moment extends far beyond one press conference, one journalist, one princess. Diana understood something that day that many of us spend lifetimes trying to learn, that our wounds, our mistakes, our most painful chapters don't have to define the entirety of our story. They can become the very things that give our story meaning, that allow us to connect with others who are suffering, that transform us from people who have merely survived into people who can help others do the same. She understood that forgiveness isn't about pretending the pain never happened, but about refusing to let that pain be the only thing that happens. That compassion isn't reserved for the perfect, but is perhaps most powerfully expressed by those who know what it means to fall and have to find the strength to rise again. Diana taught us that when someone tries to reduce you to your worst moment, you have a choice. You can meet their cruelty with cruelty, their judgment with defensiveness, their attempt to diminish you with an attempt to diminish them in return. Or you can do what she did, respond with such profound humanity that their attack becomes irrelevant, their judgment powerless, their cruelty transformed by your grace. She showed us that true strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about breaking and choosing to remain kind anyway. It's about being wounded and choosing to bandage others' wounds. It's about being doubted and choosing to believe in your purpose regardless. The legacy of this moment extends far beyond that autumn day in 1995. It became part of the constellation of moments that defined who Diana was and continues to define how we remember her. When she died less than 2 years later in that Paris tunnel, the world mourned not just a princess, but a woman who had shown us all that it was possible to be both broken and whole, both imperfect and inspiring, both hurt and healing. The flowers that piled up outside Kensington Palace, the tears shed by millions who had never met her, the way her sons speak of her legacy even now, all of it is rooted in moments like this one, where she chose grace over grievance, compassion over cruelty, humanity over image. Today, in a world that often seems to reward the loudest voice, the sharpest attack, the most brutal takedown, Diana's response reminds us that there is another way. That the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to shame you is to remain unashamed. That the most revolutionary act in a culture of judgment is to refuse to judge in return. That the bravest response to cruelty is not to become cruel, but to remain impossibly, stubbornly, beautifully kind. Her legacy lives on in every person who chooses to transform their pain into purpose, who refuses to let their past mistakes define their future contributions, who understands that being human means being imperfect and that being imperfect doesn't disqualify us from being useful, meaningful, and necessary. This story, this moment, is an invitation to all of us. An invitation to recognize that we don't have to be perfect to make a difference. That our scars can become our credentials. That our struggles can equip us rather than disqualify us. That compassion is not the luxury of the untouched, but the gift of those who have been touched by pain and have chosen not to pass it on. Diana stood in that room, faced with a question designed to break her, and she transformed it into a moment that would inspire millions. She could have defended herself, could have attacked back, could have walked away. Instead, she chose to stay, to answer, to invite her accuser and everyone watching to consider a more generous way of being human. If this story moved you, if Diana's grace in the face of cruelty reminded you that there is another way to live, another way to respond, another way to be, then carry that reminder forward. Share this message with someone who needs to hear that their imperfections don't disqualify their purpose. Subscribe to be reminded that even in a world that can be harsh and judgmental, grace still has power. That compassion still changes hearts. That one person, standing in their truth with courage and kindness, can silence a room and, in that silence, create space for something better to emerge. Diana did that on an autumn day in London. And in doing so, she left us all a blueprint for how to live, not perfectly, but purposefully. Not without pain, but not defined by it. Not as saints, but as humans who have chosen to let our suffering make us softer rather than harder, more compassionate rather than more cruel, more determined to heal than to wound. This is her legacy. This is her gift. This is what happens when grace meets cruelty and refuses to become cruel in return. The room went silent that day not because Diana said something shocking, but because she said something true. And truth, wrapped in compassion, spoken with courage, will always be the most powerful force in any room, in any moment, in any life.